Maureen O'Neill, the Director of Exhibitions and Educational Programming here. And we're so thrilled to have our special guest with us. Welcome to the Barton Art Galleries. It's nice to see some new faces. I'm Maureen O'Neill, the Director of Exhibitions and Educational Programming here. And we're so thrilled to have our special guest with us today, Liz Hall. But before one of our interns introduces her, I just wanted to mention a few things. Now that we're kind of at the end of a very busy semester, this show has been fantastic, Artists and Americans by Joseph Rafferty. He's an artist that's based in Winston-Salem, and Joseph was an artist in residence with us as well. So he spent the last 2 weeks of October here in residence with lots and lots of energy, if you know Joseph, with the student and worked with the students and did 2 community workshops on two Saturday mornings. So we had a great time with him. And then before that, we had an exhibition, a beautiful exhibition of Ben Bridgers' paintings. And Ben is coming back to be the juror for our student juried show, so that's upcoming. And as well as the seniors who are finishing this fall. So that the seniors will be in the back gallery and the juried show will be in the front gallery. And that opens on December 1st, and the reception will be 5 to 7 for that. So I just wanted to mention that Ashley Duran is a senior, and she's one of the interns here at the Barton Art Galleries, and has just been a tremendous art student as well as intern. This is her last semester. Before next semester, she goes to the North Carolina Museum of Art to be an intern there. She'll be part of the exhibition that will be in the back gallery that opens on December 1st. And we're super proud of her, and we're going to miss you a lot. So please welcome Ashley up to the podium. She's going to introduce her guest.
Liz Hull is from Tarboro, North Carolina, and graduated from Hollins University in 2003 with a BFA in art history. She moved to New York to start a career in the fine arts, first working at Sotheby's Auction House in Manhattan in the Egyptian and Western Asiatic Antiques Department, and moving on to become personal and studio assistant for Jeff Koons, the contemporary painter and sculptor. Liz worked with Jeff during an exhibition at the Château de Versailles, which was the inaugural exhibition of a contemporary artist's work in the palace's history. She also oversaw his first major retrospective at the MCA Chicago, as well as exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Gallery Berlin. Liz moved to Los Angeles after 8 years in New York to become an artist liaison and art fair coordinator at Bloom & Poe in Culver City before returning to North Carolina in 2016. In the past year, she has worked at CAM Raleigh as the exhibitions curator and has curated exhibitions that include the work of Clarence Hayward, Lakia Shepherd, Ursula Gallo, and Joseph Rafferty. We are thrilled to have Liz with us tonight at the Barton Art Galleries. Please help me welcome Liz Hull.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out tonight in this inclement weather. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Susan. Also, thank you, Teresa, for helping get the slideshow up and running. Technical difficulties are always my specialty. But I'm glad that we're all gathered here tonight to listen and to talk about art. So, art. What is art? And what is fine art? Fine art, as described in the dictionary, is a creative art, especially visual art, whose products are to be appreciated primarily or solely for their imaginative, aesthetic, and intellectual content. So, fine art is differentiated from, let's say, all of the other arts, so performance art, musical art, and it is the sort of art that people tend to value, to place on their wall, to place in museums. And when we think of fine art, we typically think of like the big names, the big art movements, primarily those in the West and primarily those that are Eurocentric. So Picasso, Dali, Monet, Degas, those are some of the names that we know. Are there any art movements that come to mind when you all think of fine art? Like maybe surrealism or pointillism, anything, any art students in here that have something that rings a bell? I mean, Impressionism, Cubism, exactly. Dada, that's always a fun one. I think that's something that Joseph Rafferty would be very akin to, kind of the happenstance, fun level of art making. But I'd like everyone to step back and think of art as something greater than a movement or a single canon of tortured artists whose brilliance is incomprehensible. What about if art is for everyone and is everyone? That there needn't be a category called outsider art, which some of you may know the term, but outsider art is a term that I tend to not want to use, as it describes artists that don't have formal training. And so many of us are artists without formal training. Because we've all made art and still make it. Art is how we express ourselves without words, and of course, sometimes with the assistance of words. Art is what the early humans made in the caves of Lascaux, which is on this slide right here, over 20,000 years ago. So much like graffiti, we think of Jean-Michel Basquiat, we think of, the trains as they pass by with someone's name on it. This is how people said, I am here and I exist. So before a universal language, art, even the simplest of marks, showed that we exist. So there's Jean-Michel in New York on the side street. And again, actually with a canvas, I think, but still out on the streets. And then some more graffiti that also shows we're there. So we've all seen, now this is an especially grimy bathroom, but you know that you've been in a bathroom stall and you've seen people who have written, or you've seen people, but you've also seen the writings on the wall where someone says something and then someone, remarks back to you, X was here, or X loves Y, or often the insult. But for better or worse, our marks are records for the next generation to learn about us. And not exclusively through the linearity of words, whose definitions are easily found in dictionaries, but to learn about our hearts and souls, the things that are hidden from sight, but which exist as much in reality as the head on our shoulders. Art is what gives us humans the drive to get up in the morning, to love one another, to hate one another, to feel passion for anything, and to see the brilliance that surrounds us, if we just take the time to look. So, not to get too grandiose and talk about the spirit of art in our souls and our hearts, which can get a little abstract, I'll rein it in because we're here to learn about how these majestic and mystical elements of art and spirit can be coalesced into our daily terrestrial routine. In a classroom, in an office, at a college, into something like a job. Because after all, we have to pay bills and we have to have roofs over our heads. So I started out going to Hollins University. This blurry image is Hollins. The large building on the lower right, that's our library. The chapel is to the left. I think I lived somewhere here at one point and then somewhere over in a field somewhere. I went to Hollins thinking that I was going to major in philosophy. I love dissecting the ways that people think. I love religion. I love spirituality, expanding my mind towards a greater knowledge of existence. And yet, after one class with Professor Kim Rhodes, who I love and adore, I knew I wanted to major in art history. So art history for me was everything. It included the theorizing of philosophy, but even the fashions of the day, current politics, social justice issues, and allowed for a different sort of contemplation and connection to myself and to other cultures. So this slide shows an artwork by the artist Liza Liu. This was created over a 5-year time period, so 1991 to 1996. And what you can't see, so sort of up close, is all of, let me see if I got a tiny note. So it's all beaded. So each teeny tiny bead was stitched by hand to create what looks just like an installation. It looks just like a room, a kitchen. So Kim Rhodes had introduced this to me. She had introduced Liza Liu, whose intricately beaded life-size domestic spaces just floored me. They were about the space, of course, the magnitude of beads, but also women's work, women's labor, a shiny beauty that hid the bloody fingers of the makers and the doers all over the world. It was more than an artwork, and it spoke to me. I became enamored with Hilma af Klint, whose work you'll see here in the Guggenheim. She was somewhat of an unknown figure from the 16th century, but as you see, these kind of mystical, magical paintings that she too was a self-taught outsider artist. Sally Mann, another artist that I was introduced to at Hollins, and whose work now sells, upwards of perhaps maybe close to 1 million, but at least in the hundreds of thousands. And also quite controversial, just, taking a look at this photograph. She photographed her children from a very young age up through adulthood. But of course, her young daughter dressed as a grown woman, it kind of is reminiscent of some of the photographs of Brooke Shields and other young actresses. Frida Kahlo, I was also introduced to when I was an undergrad. And so while I was at Hollins, I was able to do a little bit more than just go to these art history classes and learn about all these incredible artists, and specifically a lot of female artists. I was able to create an independent study around the androgyny of fashion and art and culture. And then my thesis was equally unfocused on the Western canon, highlighting non-Western works of the Dogon. Here is a sculpture from the Dogon, their culture in Northern Africa, which is very reminiscent of a lot of early Western artists. So from the left, you'll see Modigliani, and then compared to the right, which are African masks. The Dene, also known as the Navajo in the American Southwest, creating their sand paintings, which this one would not have been completed because if it had been, the photograph would transmit the power of that painting. So that's an incomplete sand painting, and a lot of them get a bit more abstract, along with the Aboriginal, which was another culture that I studied. So all of these non-Western cultures were the focus of, as I saw it, the makings of something like Jackson Pollock's splatter paintings. So after Hollins, I moved to New York and began working at Sotheby's, the auction house. A lot of people think that I'm talking about the real estate company down here, and I could not do that if I had every degree in the world. Real estate is not my forte. So let me just see where we are. So at Sotheby's, I worked there for about 4 years. And during that time, I realized that, the art world was encompassed by so many varying levels that there were a number of things I could do. But the question is, with a love of art, how do you make an art career? How do you continue on? So you all may know some of the jobs that exist in the arts. Sotheby's is an area of commerce. That is where the art comes in and it's exchanged. You're not working with artists necessarily. Sometimes a living artist you will be able to, come in contact with, but primarily you might meet celebrities, you might meet very wealthy people, but you understand the commerce aspect of art. But I wanted to be working with artists, and I wanted to see the art as it was being made. I wanted to understand the impetus for the art being made. So the job of maybe curator, becoming an artist myself, a gallerist, consultant, appraiser, conservator. There's shippers, handlers, journalists, you name it. There are a lot of careers that can be had within the arts. And I could have kept going to school. I could have gotten a PhD, but I went to New York instead and learned a great deal at Sotheby's. So this is a little blurry, and this is a series that Jeff does not really like. So this is Jeff Koons. This is his Made in Heaven series. I always really liked this series because it was so controversial at the time. There are many more explicit photos. That's his then wife, Cicciolina, who was a member of Italian Parliament, but was also a porn star at the time of this photographic series. But it was so controversial. These things were blown up and they were put on billboards in Chelsea. And even with their sort of kitschiness, they kind of, flipped the art world on its head. Another thing is, this is also the work of Jeff Koons. This is his celebration series. So the Balloon Dogs, he made a series of 5, it's edition of 5. And those are just, children's toys that have been blown up. They're made of aluminum and painted with automotive paint. So I began working for Jeff in order to understand process, in order to be kind of still involved with, there is a heavy commerce side to his business. A studio of about 180 artists when I was working there. He had a sculpture department, a sculpture painting department, and a painting department. So I was there in the capacity as his personal assistant and assistant studio manager, leading tours, organizing the shipping of artworks, and kind of just making things happen. This is Michael Jackson in Bubbles, one of his famous sculptures that was at the Chateau Versailles in Versailles, France. He was the first contemporary artist to exhibit his work in the chateau, and from there, several others have since had exhibitions. Contemporary artists have since had exhibitions, but there was a moment when Jeff wanted to take out a window of Versailles to completely cut a hole in the side of the palace, which of course they said no to. It's this historic artifact, but the exhibition was beautiful, and even with his famous vacuum cleaners in plexi cases next to these beautiful Victorian paintings. So after working with Jeff, I decided that I wanted to be more hands-on, and I started to work at Leo Koenig, which is a gallery in Chelsea in New York. And this is the work of Hermann Nietzsche, who is a famous Austrian actionist. It was a pretty messy first exhibition, as you can tell by this image. So I think that when you're working in the galleries and when you're working for artists, you have to be open to the various processes that they have in mind. And really, for me, it's always been that the artist leads the way. So even though Herman's exhibition had literal blood on the floor, pig blood on the floor, on the tablecloths, it was still art, and it was still his way of expressing. So a lot of these blood-stained relics were then stretched and made as canvases and put on the walls. So not unlike a Jackson Pollock of splattered paint, but of splattered blood, and perhaps feet walking on it. There were all of these various ritualistic performances. So you have this canvas that has all of this performance and information on it, despite the actual medium of the work being a little unsavory. But also while working at Leo Koenig, I was able to work with the artist Tony Metelli, who made these realistic sculptures. So being so realistically rendered, a lot of people, thought that it was easy to bypass the message and simply see it for its literal nature. But much like artists before him, Tony was breaking down our way of seeing. So yes, he was presenting literal objects, but with humor and extreme skill that doesn't happen overnight. I think that sometimes it's too easy to see these things that look so realistic because there are giant factories that make these sculptures, and there's Hollywood that makes these beautiful productions, and it's very glossy and clean. But these sculptures, specifically this one and the meat head, those were made in a very small studio in Brooklyn with Tony and 1.5 other assistants. And I know that the images are a little blurry, but his work is extremely beautiful. So working in the galleries gave me a good insight into artist process and working with a variety of people and personalities. I moved to Los Angeles to work at a gallery called Blum and Poe, and there I worked with they had about 25 artists on the roster at the time that I was there. It's since increased, but I worked with Henry Taylor, whose work you see here. Henry is primarily a painter, but this was a sculpture installation, harking back to some of his southern roots. He lives in California, but he does have a lot of family from the South, a lot of sharecropper family members. So this install was meant to look like the owner of the plantation's home, the dining room, with the fields of crops, and a painting of his grandfather on the right and his grandmother on the left. And actually, I will just go back to this quickly. So one other element that I want to bring to everyone's attention is that when artists do have exhibitions and when they do have a vision, whether it's blood on the floor in one case or it's dirt on the floor, it should be one of those things that's honored. And I think that as stewards of the art community, we have the responsibility to kind of stick to what the artist envisions, whether it's outside of the box, whether it's messy, whether it's untidy, whether it means that we have to clean up a lot the next day. This is the work of another artist with whom I worked, and actually another one of the artists that even before I went to Holland's, whose work I had seen, and it really blew my mind. And it's almost cartoonish, and you're not quite sure if it's body parts or what's going on here. This is Carol Dunham. His nickname is Tip, so I often called him Tip. You might know his daughter, Lena Dunham, who wrote Girls. People tend to know her, but I defer to Tip. He was one of the artists that I worked with closely at Blum and Poe. This is another one of his works. He moved into actual body parts that, and Bathers was a whole series that he did that was quite different than his abstract series. And after Los Angeles, I moved to Ibiza to set up Art Projects Ibiza with a good friend and a former colleague who was an art consultant with the gallery where I worked. So this is just another facet of what you can do in the art world is if you're working at a gallery, you meet so many different people. Maybe you meet a collector that wants you to work on their collection. Maybe you become an art handler and you oversee the hanging and install. Maybe you become a restorer and you restore their artwork. Sounds like someone really wants to hear what I have to say. But in this case, we had a client. Art consultants have a range of clients. They could have 50 or they could have 5. The art consultant I worked with, Kimberly Chang, had about 10. And the intention was to work with clients who wanted to create museum quality collections and outfit their homes, or in this case, set up a gallery in Ibiza where they had a vacation home. So we set up an art gallery, which was Art Projects Ibiza, and we also set up a foundation, which was called Lune Rouge Ibiza. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. So in this case, we set up an art foundation and a gallery for the client. Also outfit his home with artwork and also participated in a dinner theater space that he wanted to create. So a lot of things happening. It kind of depends on the client. But in order to work with the consultant that I worked with, or in order to be a client, you would not be a collector who would flip your artwork in 5 years. You would not be a client who flipped your artwork in 10 years. You would buy the artwork with the intention of holding on to it, and you would buy at a certain threshold, which tended to be quite high, but it was with the intention of creating museum quality collection. So it is one of those areas that was perhaps out of reach for the majority of the population, but it does bring to light the way that I kind of want to kind of close out this talk, which is the importance of collecting and the importance of artists having autonomy. So artists tend to want to sell out of, so these are more images of Art Projects Ibiza. That is Takashi Murakami, the artist. So artists tend to want to sell out of their studio, and I think that is a fine thing to be able to do. But in order to have a career, because it is a career in the arts, it's it's not something that you want to always be doing on the side of whatever your main gig is. If you really want to be an artist and an artist in full, you need to be able to protect yourself, have your own contracts, and I think that varies for each person, but ensuring that if someone does buy the artwork from your studio and you don't have a gallery representing you, you don't have any other representative, that you ensure in writing that they don't sell your work in 2 years, maybe, or 3 years, or 5 years, whenever you become famous, whenever your career makes a bit of headway. And then if you're okay with people selling, then you put in a clause that says, I'm fine if you sell, but then I get a percentage of the sales, which is generally 20 to maybe 40%. And all of these things are good for artists to know, and I could elaborate so much more on that. I mean, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. But as collectors and as people who are philanthropists of the arts, those of us who are able to collect big or small, it's really important to not hoard the work or hide it away. It's important for the work to be seen. It adds value to the artist's career. And, sometimes people don't think about that, but the more that an artist's work is seen, the more that the artist has exhibitions, whether at galleries that are on a side street or a main gallery in New York City, a museum out in the country or a museum in town. It adds to the artist's resume, and it adds to the value of their work and the longevity of their career. So let me go to the last. So this is, I just wanted to close with a work by Joseph Rafferty that, so Joseph is exhibiting at CAM at the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh. He has a beautiful selection of photographs. We kind of collaborated on some spontaneous wall graffiti, a little bit of text pieces, as well as 2 films. And this work to me it kind of symbolizes the hope and the dread contained in one image of the art world. So someone perhaps making an offering, perhaps that's going to drop and throw him over, or perhaps he's throwing something over for someone to catch. There's a lot that can be said about this image, but I thought it was a good one to close out with because we're surrounded by Joseph's work. So I know I covered a lot of my experience, but I would love any questions or any insights that anyone wants to share. Or if I need to go back to any of the earlier slides. Yes.
When you worked for Jeff Koons, was it in the beginning of his career, or was it when he was kind of catapulting upward?
He had already become quite well known. So when I worked for Jeff, I began working for him in 2005, and until 2009. And so he had really kind of become recognized in the late 70s, so 78 though.
He's out dancing with Madonna.
Oh no, he kind of wishes he was, but no, I mean, Jeff, so he showed with Ileana Sonnabend. So Sonnabend Gallery, one of these iconic New York galleries that really kind of set careers for a lot of artists that we know today. But when Jeff kind of hit it big it began with the slide that I showed of the Made in Heaven series, the somewhat pornographic series. That then he moved into the Celebration series was probably his height. And that era was 96 through 2004. When I was working with him, he continued works that were similar to Celebration in that they were these large inflatables, but they weren't the giant inflatable dogs, and they weren't all shiny. A lot of them were matte, and they were inner tubes, like swimming inner tubes. And he kind of focused a lot more on painting and collage.
I was just trying to kind of a two-part question, but what did you see that elevated him from being in the New York City art scene and just like blowing up to international? Like, was there one thing that you saw? I'm trying to figure that out. I mean, he's a marketing genius for one, but
yeah, I mean, I think that it's that fine line between taking an object that's so everyday, so mundane, and placing it on a pedestal. And that's essentially what he did. Whether it's a literal thing on a pedestal, which he did with basketballs, or in tanks, in the floating tanks, the Equilibrium series, or if it was the vacuum cleaners that was shown at the New Museum. That was his first museum exhibition. So I think taking the mundane and elevating it, which is not unlike Marcel Duchamp with his photos of the armut, the toilet bowl, and I think that is a beautiful way of looking at things in order to see the beauty in everyday objects. But yeah, with Jeff, he was definitely unique and stood out among his peers. Yeah. Yes.
You've worked with like a lot of great artists so far, but do you yourself make any art for your own?
When I was at Hollins, I took photography, and I loved being in the studio. I love being in a dark studio, working with the chemicals, not with a lot of technology. And I think I've always worked in a very analog way. I do make perfume, which I see as a performance piece. So artwork for me that is ephemeral in nature. So for example, even when I highlight the Dene or the Navajo people making sand paintings, those sand paintings are destroyed. And you can't take a photograph of them. And I think there's something so beautiful and special in that, that it's not a thing that you can easily commodify. You could have a certificate of authenticity, which a lot of artists do these days, but it's less attainable. And I think that it's I don't want to laugh at it, the people who want to commodify it, but it is kind of funny. So yeah, perfume is how I make my work. But yes,
it's interesting how your work in a way is a critique or is a pushback on the work you've been involved with commodification and the selling of fine art, and how some of the artists you've picked too in some ways are a critique on the idea of fine art, that kind of making the everyday as art versus the Renaissance era or something else that is just elite courts. And so I'm wondering if you have reflected on that kind of process of how we're in a moment where you said before about we're all artists or art is for everyone kind of thing, right? But at the same breath, we also have art being a very wealthy, and art exchange and culture you were talking about is also being something that can still be of an elite kind of restrictive or gatekeeping thing as well. So do you kind of wrestle with that paradox?
I do, but I think that when I worked in the galleries, and fortunately I worked with fairly ethical folks in the galleries, and definitely at Sotheby's, that the department that I worked in, the antiquities department, really I don't think that I've met finer gentlemen in my life who respected the art so much, respected if people brought in a fake that was very dear to them. We expressed that it is dear. It's just that the market doesn't see it that way, so you should keep it for yourself. But as far as these collectors, amassing these collections that are perhaps very restrictive financially for most people, I think that the goal is that if they're doing it, have the work be seen, have there be education around each piece, have the artist be involved, have the artist's words be written down. I think that it's really important not to obfuscate that. The worst thing that can happen is to sell to someone who hides the work away or flips it. And so just for everyone to know, flipping an artwork is, well, you buy it one day for $5,000 and then you see the artist's career escalating. It's like 15, 20, 30, 50, 60,000. And you say, oh, well, I need a little money right now. I'm gonna sell it. That doesn't really do the artist's career any good. You can go to the artist gallery, and if you do that and say, I'm looking at selling this, then it's kind of managed by their crew. But did that answer? Did I go off on a little segue? And you had a question?
It's more of like a statement rather.
Okay.
So I find it very interesting, the dichotomy between this sort of art world and the online art world, because online the audience and the type of art the artists are putting out is very different from what these sort of artists are doing. So I find it interesting how very different it is and the type of different art that's celebrated online versus like in person in like these really respected museums and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this work is also sold online. There's a great website that is respected called Artsy. I hate the name, sorry, I do, but it's artsy.net, and it's run or it's owned by the largest gallery or the biggest blue chip gallerist in the world, Larry Gagosian. But it is a equitable and democratic platform for galleries and to exhibit artists that they to sell artwork from artists that they show, as well. If you're a solo artist and you can get your work on there, they do have a vetting process, but it's not especially stringent. You do see some of these pieces on there. I would suggest not going to places like eBay and, some areas of the internet can get a little murky. And I do think that it is a struggle between being, democratic and allowing artists to sell when they want to sell, because they need to sell. Artists need to make a living, but it's just that fine balance of protecting your work. And then if you're a gallerist or a representative, protecting your it's essentially, I hate to say it, but that artist is your investment. Help them, nurture them like a plant. You plant the seed, you water it. You don't overwater it, underwater it, you take care of it. So, right there. Yes?
How long would you say it took you to find your passion, the job that you have now? You kind of walk us through your process, but how long did that actually take you?
I think you just find along the way, day by day. For me, I've always known that I loved writing, and I've always known that I loved looking and dissecting. I thought that I was going to go to school for philosophy because I love to just sit and dissect and think and talk and wonder, why do people think that, the sky is blue when other people, just all of the ideas. But I think that if you just try to hone in on just a few select things, I think you know in your gut, which is not really a great answer, but I knew right away, that I wanted to be an art historian. So that was the one path that opened up to many. You had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, of all the places that you've been in, we've been a little bit similar, from Southern California, children in New York and Spain, but we're here, and you've been kind of in all these places. What brought you from all of the high-level galleries and artists to want to go to a non-collecting museum like CAM? And be back in North Carolina, which is so different than everywhere you've been.
Yeah. Well, I grew up here, so I'm familiar with the area, and my family, my parents. They at one point, I think my dad said something that he would be sad if I left. Again. So, but it was that in tandem with, again, that sort of gut feeling of, kind of knowing what I wanted to do and knowing that art history was the degree that I needed to, the path that I needed to follow. And I'd actually come back and I wasn't sure that I was going to stay. And I got some folks in the art world knew that I was looking to maybe go back to LA, and I got a job to manage this great artist studio, making kind of okay money. But I knew it was still going to be kind of a little bit of a struggle. And that's a thing in the arts in the larger cities, in any city. they don't exactly pay, so you have to find ways that it fulfills you in other ways. But also, in particular, CAM being non-collecting, I really like the idea of that in that there's a huge history of that. It's a Kunsthal, so a hall of art. So art passes in and then it passes out. So it's intended to be the place for the most contemporary, the most lively art happenings. So whether we do that all the time or just some of the time, that's the intention. And I think to be on the cusp of things is important. Change is good. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Oh yeah. Oh, thank you. Thanks.
And we'll hang out